before we step into ancient Egypt, a quick note. If calm, slow storytelling helps you unwind, then subscribe to Amber and Echoes. That way, whenever you're ready to fall asleep to history again, you'll know the story of ancient Egypt begins not with pyramids rising from the desert floor, but with water running through a long, narrow valley. Long before kings wore crowns of red and white, and centuries before stone was stacked into the great monuments of Giza, a particular combination of river, climate, and human adaptation began to shape one of the most enduring civilizations in history. Between roughly 6,000 and 3,000 BCE, along a ribbon of green cutting through an otherwise harsh landscape, communities of farmers, herders, traders, and emerging elites slowly created the political, economic, and religious foundations that would later support the pharaohs. Understanding this earlier world, its geography, its climate, its small villages, and first regional powers is essential if we want to understand why ancient Egypt became what it did, and why it mattered so deeply in the ancient world. If you imagine Egypt on a map, you see something deceptively simple. A long river flowing generally from south to north, fed by distant rains in the Ethiopian highlands and lakes in Central Africa, emptying finally into the Mediterranean Sea. On either side of this river, however, lies an environment that has always been far less forgiving. To the west stretches the Sahara Desert, and to the east, the rocky eastern desert that leads toward the Red Sea. Between these arid expanses lies the Nile Valley itself, a narrow corridor of cultivable land that in many stretches is only a few kilometers wide. Each year in antiquity, the river rose and spilled over its banks, leaving behind a thin layer of dark, fertile silt on the floodplain. Ancient observers came to rely on this cycle, the annual inundation, roughly in the summer and early autumn, watered the fields naturally and made it possible to grow grain on a reliable schedule. Modern historians and geographers have often emphasized that this regularity, this dependable rhythm of high and low water, was one of the key conditions that made a dense agricultural society sustainable in Egypt. Yet the Nile's generosity only became decisive after a major shift in climate. For thousands of years earlier in the Holocene, much of what is now desert in North Africa was comparatively lush. Lakes dotted the landscape, and grasslands supported herds of wild animals and eventually pastoralist communities. This period, sometimes called the African Humid Period or the Green Sahara, lasted until roughly the middle of the Holocene, when a gradual but relentless drying trend set in. As rainfall diminished and lakes shrank, the Sahara slowly transformed into the arid desert we recognize today. Archaeological and climatological studies suggest that, as these conditions worsened over the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, many groups who had once lived in more open desert regions increasingly sought the security of permanent water along the Nile Valley. In this sense, the river did not just nourish an existing farming population. It drew in people from a wide hinterland, concentrating them along its banks and intensifying competition for land and resources. Some scholars see this convergence. People pressed into a long, narrow oasis between desert and river as a crucial backdrop to the rise of more complex political organizations in early Egypt. At the same time, the way people lived and made a living in northeastern Africa was changing. During the Mesolithic and early Neolithic periods, communities across the region experimented with new forms of subsistence. Excavations at sites like Nabta Playa and Bur Kaisiba in what is now southern Egypt show that by the 7th and 6th millennia BCE, people there were managing cattle and later keeping domesticated sheep and goats, alongside hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. There is lively debate about whether the shift to full-scale farming and herding in the Nile Valley was primarily driven by influences from Southwest Asia or emerged more locally through a mixture of imported species and indigenous experimentation. Some researchers emphasize the introduction of domestic animals and certain crops from the Near East. Others point out that the earliest solid evidence of domestic plants and animals in the Nile Valley appears relatively late, in the early 5th millennium BCE in northern Egypt, and a bit later in the south, suggesting a gradual, regionally specific process. Taken together, the evidence indicates that by the 5th millennium BCE, parts of Egypt were home to communities that combined herding, cultivation, fishing, and foraging in flexible ways, adjusting their strategies to the opportunities and stresses of their environment. Over time, the balance shifted more firmly toward settled agriculture, especially along the Nile floodplain. The predictable rise and fall of the river, together with the thin belt of fertile alluvium, made grain farming increasingly attractive. Instead of moving with herds or tracking seasonal water sources, more and more people could remain in one place, storing surplus harvests and investing in permanent structures. Archaeologists see this transition reflected in the remains of early villages. Clusters of houses, storage pits, and simple irrigation features, alongside cemeteries where the dead were buried with goods that speak to emerging notions of status and identity. The story of ancient Egypt, in other words, begins with ordinary tasks, tending fields, digging storage pits, firing pottery. But it is out of these everyday activities that more elaborate social and political structures would eventually grow. By convention, scholars refer to the long period before the first unified Egyptian state as prehistoric, and more specifically, pre-dynastic Egypt. In broad terms, this covers the time from the first substantial human settlements in the region up until about 3100 BCE, when the early dynastic period begins. Within this wide span, archaeologists divide the pre-dynastic into a series of regional cultures, each named for the site where it was first recognized. These labels, Badarian, Nakata, Merimd, Mahdi, and others, are modern tools for organizing material evidence rather than rigid categories that ancient people would have recognized. In reality, the transitions between them were gradual, with older traditions fading slowly, while new ones spread along trade networks or through migration and imitation. Still, these cultural phases help us trace how local communities along the Nile and in the Delta gradually developed the economic complexity, social inequalities, and symbolic systems that made a centralized state possible. One of the earliest well-studied cultures in Upper Egypt, the southern stretch of the Nile Valley, is known as the Badarian culture. Centered around the area of El Badari in Middle Egypt, this culture flourished roughly between 5000 and 4000 BCE. The Badarian people lived in small villages and hamlets along the edge of the floodplain, cultivating grain, herding livestock, and making distinctive pottery with finely polished surfaces and characteristic shapes. Their cemeteries provide especially rich information. Bodies were placed on their sides in simple pit graves, often accompanied by pottery, stone tools, and personal ornaments such as beads. Some graves contain noticeably richer assemblages than others, more finely made vessels, more numerous ornaments, and imported materials, suggesting that even at this early date, social differences were emerging. Researchers who have systematically analyzed these burials argue that Badarian society already showed signs of inequality, with a recognizable elite segment distinguished in death by the quality and quantity of grave goods. This could imply that competition for resources, control of trade, or success in farming was beginning to translate into hereditary status. From the Badarian horizon, there is a clear line of development into what archaeologists call the Nakata culture, another Upper Egyptian pre-dynastic culture that lasted roughly from 4000 to 3000 BCE, named after the site of Nakata in the Kina Governorate. This culture is usually divided into three subphases: Nakata I, and III, which together chart a steady growth in social complexity. In Nakata I, we see continuity with Badarian traditions in pottery and burial customs, but also new decorative styles and forms. By Nakata II, the archaeological record reveals more specialized craft production, including high-quality stone vessels and elaborately painted pottery, as well as increasing evidence of long-distance trade. Imported obsidian from what is now Ethiopia, cedar wood from Lebanon, and other non-local materials have been found in Nakata period contexts, indicating that Upper Egyptian communities were actively linked into wider exchange networks reaching deep into Nubia and across to the Levant and beyond. Scholars interpret this surge in exotic goods as both an economic and a political phenomenon. Controlling access to such materials could enhance the prestige of local leaders, who might then use these items in feasting, gift-giving, or burial display to reinforce their authority. Meanwhile, the Nile Delta and northern Egypt were following their own partially parallel path. For a long time, the lack of clear archaeological evidence from the Delta led some researchers to imagine it as either sparsely inhabited or culturally behind Upper Egypt in the pre-dynastic period. More recent excavations, however, have changed this picture. Sites such as Merimd and the Madi Budo cultural complex show that Lower Egypt housed communities with their own rich traditions, including substantial settlements with evidence for planned architecture and strong links to the southern Levant. At Madi, near modern Cairo, archaeologists have uncovered storage pits, houses, and an impressive array of imported pottery and tools that closely resemble those of contemporary Chalcolithic cultures in the Levant. This pattern suggests that northern Egyptian communities were actively engaged in overland and maritime trade, acting as intermediaries between the Nile Valley and the eastern Mediterranean. When we compare cemeteries in early Lower Egypt with those in Upper Egypt, we often see fewer signs of pronounced inequality in the north during the earlier phases, which some scholars take to mean that status differences were expressed more subtly there, or that social stratification intensified later. The differing burial patterns could reflect real variations in how communities organized power and identity, or they may be partly a result of what has and has not survived in the archaeological record. Based on what we know, it seems reasonable to say that while Upper Egypt developed especially pronounced elite centers by the late pre-dynastic, the Delta was never simply a passive backwater. It contributed actively to the networks of trade, ideas, and technologies that shaped early Egypt as a whole. By the later Naqada II and Naqada III phases, certain Upper Egyptian sites stand out as emerging centers of regional power. Hierakonpolis, ancient Nekhin, Naqada itself, and the area around Abydos all show evidence of substantial settlements, specialized crafts, and elaborate cemeteries reserved for high-status individuals. At Hierakonpolis in particular, excavations of the elite cemetery known as HK6 have revealed large, architecturally complex tombs accompanied by remarkable animal burials, lions, an elephant, and other creatures likely used to signal power and status. This kind of display suggests that local rulers and their families were using not only imported goods, but also symbolic associations with dangerous or prestigious animals to distinguish themselves from the wider population. Around Abydos, in the cemetery of el-Kab, a large multi-chambered tomb known as Uj, dated to around 3300 BCE, contained thousands of ceramic vessels, many imported from Palestine, as well as small ivory tags bearing some of the earliest known Egyptian hieroglyphic signs. These tags appear to have been used to label jars and goods, indicating that by this time, some form of administrative writing was already in use to track commodities and perhaps to mark ownership or origin. Based on this evidence, historians infer that a nascent state structure with bureaucratic practices and regional rulers was already in place in Upper Egypt before the traditional unification of the country under later kings. All of these developments, the concentration of population along the Nile, the gradual shift to intensive agriculture, the growth of trade routes linking Egypt to Nubia and the Levant, and the rise of regional centers dominated by ambitious elites were deeply intertwined. The geography of Egypt, with its narrow cultivable zone hemmed in by desert, made it easier for emerging authorities to monitor and tax agricultural production, especially in comparison to more open landscapes elsewhere. Some theorists argue that this environmental circumscription helped push societies along the Nile towards stronger, more centralized forms of organization, since migration away from authority was relatively difficult once the Sahara had fully dried. At the same time, the annual flood both sustained and threatened communities. Managing irrigation, maintaining dikes, and coordinating labor would have encouraged cooperative structures that powerful families could eventually dominate. It is possible that religious ideas also played an early role in legitimizing authority. At Nabta Playa, for example, a complex of stone alignments and cattle burials from the 6th and 5th millennia BCE has been interpreted as evidence of ritual practices centered on livestock and the sky. Some researchers suggest that this early cattle cult may foreshadow later Egyptian traditions associated with deities like Hathor, who was often depicted as a cow or a woman with cow's horns. While we cannot be certain about direct continuity, the parallels in symbolism and the prominence of cattle in both contexts have led scholars to see Nabta Playa and similar sites as part of a long, evolving religious landscape that eventually fed into the beliefs of dynastic Egypt. By the closing centuries of the 4th millennium BCE, then, Egypt was already far more than a scattering of villages along a river. It was a land of competing regional centers in Upper Egypt, lively trading communities in Lower Egypt, and a set of shared. Those new developments did not arrive with a single dramatic moment, but unfolded gradually through the actions of particular communities and the ambitions of particular leaders who began to stand out from the landscape of villages and small towns along the Nile. In Upper Egypt, places such as Hierakonpolis, Nakata, and the region around Abydos became focal points of power. Their leaders still depended on the river and the harvest, as all Egyptians did, but they also supervised workshops, controlled important stretches of trade routes, and presided over rituals that gave their authority a sacred aura. Over generations, that combination of economic control military strength, and religious prestige pushed some local chiefs beyond the status of village headmen and into a new role that we can cautiously call early kingship. Archaeology lets us glimpse these emerging powers most clearly in the cemeteries they left behind. At Hierakonpolis, for example, some graves in the elite cemetery are markedly larger and more complex than the simple pits used for ordinary people. They contain rich offerings, and in several cases, the burials of animals that would not normally belong to a village herd. Dogs, wild cattle, even lions. The animals were laid to rest in an ordered way near the tombs of high-status individuals, based on what we know about later Egyptian symbolism. This could imply that those buried there were deliberately associating themselves with powerful creatures standing on the boundary between wilderness and order. Later royal scenes of the king subduing wild beasts seem to echo, in more formal language, ideas that were already taking shape in these early graves. Abydos, further north in Upper Egypt, offers a complementary glimpse of the same process. On the desert edge, west of the modern town, lies a cemetery known as el-Kab, where some of the earliest rulers of Egypt were buried. One tomb in particular, designated by archaeologists as Uj, and dated to the late 4th millennium BCE, stands out. It is divided into several chambers and contained imported jars, fine pottery, seal impressions, and small ivory tags. Those tags bear tiny incised signs and numerals. Many specialists agree that they are among the earliest evidence for writing in Egypt, used to label and count goods. If this reading is correct, then even before the famous dynasties, an emerging elite at Abydos was already using a simple written system to manage resources across a growing domain. When we step back from individual sites and put these pieces together, a larger picture begins to form. By the closing centuries of the pre-dynastic period, Upper Egypt was dotted with regional centers dominated by lineage heads or chiefs whose power reached beyond a single hamlet. They drew in grain as tax or tribute, directed labor to dig canals and build enclosures, and sponsored rituals that linked their households to local gods and ancestral spirits. Their control over trade routes brought them exotic materials from Nubia to the south and the Levant to the northeast, metals, fine stone, incense, resins, and distinctive pottery. These items could then be redistributed to followers or displayed as markers of rank. Over time, some centers outpaced others. Hierakonpolis, Nakata, and Thinis, near Abydos, seem to have emerged as major players in this competitive environment. It is reasonable to assume that alliances, marriages, and small-scale conflicts constantly shifted the balance among them, even if the details are lost to us. Lower Egypt, in the Delta, had its own important communities, especially those tied into trade with the Eastern Mediterranean. But as the 4th millennium drew to a close, the material record suggests that the symbols and goods of Upper Egypt spread northward. Pottery styles, motifs on objects, and the presence of Upper Egyptian elite items in northern contexts all point toward a growing influence from the south. This does not automatically mean that warlike conquest was underway at every moment. Influence can spread through migration, trade, and prestige, as well as through direct force. Still, by the late Naqada III period, many scholars infer from this distribution of styles and prestige goods that one Upper Egyptian polity, centered near Abydos and perhaps Thinis, had begun to dominate its rivals and to project that influence into the delta. Much later, Egyptian priest scholars and Greek writers would remember this process in simplified form, telling of a single founding king, Menes, who united Upper and Lower Egypt and began the line of pharaohs. Modern evidence complicates that story. In archaeological sources from the very end of the pre-dynastic period and the start of the First Dynasty, one name stands out prominently: Narmer. His name appears in early inscriptions and seal impressions, and it is linked to an important object discovered at Hierakonpolis, now known as the Narmer palette. This ceremonial stone palette is carved on both sides with carefully arranged scenes. On one face, a large figure identified by the name Narmer wears the tall white crown associated with Upper Egypt and raises a mace over a kneeling captive. On the other, he appears in the flat red crown associated with Lower Egypt, presiding over a procession and inspecting rows of defeated enemies. Above him, standards and divine emblems underline his status. Below, a powerful bull knocks down the walls of a fortified town. There has been much debate over how literally these images should be read. Some scholars see the palette as a direct record of Narmer's military campaign to conquer the north. Others emphasize that it is a ritual object, likely dedicated in a temple, and argue that its scenes condense a broader message about the king's role as conqueror and unifier, rather than documenting a single historical clash. On balance, the imagery lines up closely with the idea of unification and comes from exactly the time when Egypt was becoming a single kingdom. So, it is difficult to avoid seeing a connection. It seems reasonable to conclude that Narmer was one of the central figures in the final stage of unifying the two lands. Whether or not every detail on the palette refers to a specific event, in later king lists and historical traditions, the figure called Menes stands at the head of the First Dynasty. Many modern Egyptologists think that Menes may be a later rendering of Narmer's name or a title attached to him. Others propose that Narmer was the last great ruler of the pre-dynastic era, and that his successor, Horaha, should be identified with Menes instead. Here, the written sources are sparse and sometimes contradictory, so absolute certainty is unlikely. What we can say based on the convergence of archaeological and textual evidence, is that around 3100 BCE, a ruler from Upper Egypt extended his power northward, bringing both the valley and the delta into a single political framework. From that point onward, Egyptian kings would speak of themselves as rulers of the two lands, and their crowns and titulary would reflect a dual authority over Upper and Lower Egypt. Unification did not erase regional differences overnight. People in the delta continued to live in their marshy, branching waterways, while those in the south farmed in a narrower valley between high desert cliffs. Local cults and traditions persisted. What changed was the framework within which these differences existed. At the top stood a king who claimed divine sanction, presented as the living Horus, protector of Egypt and guarantor of cosmic order. His name was enclosed in a serek, a stylized representation of a palace facade topped by the falcon of Horus, and stamped on ceilings, carved on stone, and painted on jars. Below him, a hierarchy of officials began to emerge. Some managed royal estates, others oversaw districts, storage facilities, or workshops. Writing, still used sparingly, marked ownership, tracked deliveries, and recorded the names of high officials and the king himself. The unified kingdom also required a new political center. While earlier rulers had been buried at Abydos and perhaps ruled from nearby Thinis, the state now needed a seat of government that could easily reach both Upper and Lower Egypt. According to later tradition, the first king of United Egypt founded a city at the point where the Nile Valley opens into the delta, a place the Egyptians called White Walls and the Greeks later called Memphis. Even if the exact founder's name is debated, the location makes obvious sense. From this vantage point, the king and his court could supervise the main north-south artery of the country and watch over routes leading east toward Sinai and the Levant, west toward desert oases, and north toward the Mediterranean. Over time, Memphis grew into a major administrative and religious center, with nearby burial grounds providing resting places for officials, and eventually for kings. Within Egypt, the line of kings continued through what we call the First Dynasty. Names such as Horaha, Jur, Jet, Den, Ainjib, Semerkit, and Ka come down to us, carved on stone vessels or stamped in clay. Their tombs at Abydos are large mud brick structures, surrounded in some cases by subsidiary graves that appear to belong to retainers who died with, or for, their king. The idea that the king's household extended beyond his lifetime, continuing to serve him in the next world, is already visible here. Meanwhile, another cemetery at Saqqara, near Memphis, houses the burials of high officials, whose mastaba tombs, rectangular, flat-roofed superstructures, anticipate later monumental building in stone. The layout of these cemeteries suggests a world in which hierarchy was expressed not only in life, but also in the architecture of death. The second dynasty, which followed, is less clearly understood, but traces of tension appear in the record. At some point, a king named Peripson adopted an unusual royal name in which the traditional Horus falcon was replaced by the animal of the god Seth. Some researchers read this departure from earlier practice as a sign of conflict, perhaps between factions based in Upper and Lower Egypt, or between different religious orientations, though the available evidence does not allow a definitive explanation. Later, a ruler called Kasekum, and then Kasekemwi, whose name in its final form can be read as the two powerful ones appear, seems to have reunited competing factions. Statues of Kasekemwi show him wearing royal regalia and seated in a dignified pose. Inscriptions on their bases enumerate large numbers of northern enemies defeated. While the figures are almost certainly exaggerated, they underline a message that the king had crushed opposition and restored unity to the realm. By the close of the second dynasty, the basic pattern of Egyptian kingship and administration had been set. A single ruler, embodying divine sanction, stood at the apex of society. Below him, officials managed a country that stretched from the Delta marshes to the Nubian frontier and projected influence beyond. Writing was firmly established as a tool of power, though its full literary potential still lay in the future. The idea of Egypt as the two lands, united under one crown and one king, had survived early crises and proven resilient. At the same time, new possibilities were opening up. Royal tombs and the tombs of high officials were growing larger and more ambitious, hinting at a shift from mud brick to stone. The resources and organizational skills of the state had reached a level where entirely new kinds of monuments might be attempted, using architecture to express ideas about eternity, kingship, and the relationship between earth and sky. Standing on the threshold of what historians call that sense of approaching triumph was not an illusion. Over the generations that followed, the rulers of Egypt would turn their hard-won unity and administrative experience into something visually and architecturally unprecedented. The same organizational skills that had allowed early kings to levy taxes, move goods, and put down internal strife were now applied to a different kind of project, reshaping the edge of the desert into a landscape of carefully planned tombs, temples, and monumental markers of royal presence. In what historians call the Old Kingdom, roughly the 3rd to the 6th dynasties, Egyptian kings began to express their authority and their vision of the afterlife in forms that would dominate the skyline and the imagination for millennia. The first clear sign of this new architectural ambition appears in the reign of a king named Djoser, founder of the 3rd dynasty. Djoser ruled from Memphis and, like his predecessors, maintained control over a country stretching from the Delta to the southern frontier. What set his reign apart was the decision to commission a tomb unlike any that had come before, on a plateau west of Memphis, at a place we now call Saqqara. Until this point, elite burials had typically taken the form of mastabas, rectangular mud brick structures built above underground burial chambers. Djoser's architect, a high official named Imhotep, oversaw a radical transformation of this type. Instead of one low rectangle, he stacked successively smaller rectangles on top of one another, building them in stone rather than mud brick. The result was a six-stepped structure rising above a vast walled complex, the Step Pyramid. The Step Pyramid complex at Saqqara was more than a tomb. Enclosed by a high limestone wall, it contained courtyards, chapels, and dummy buildings, carved and erected in stone to imitate the wooden and reed architecture used in royal ceremonies. This could suggest that the complex was designed as a kind of eternal stage on which elements of the king's earthly rituals could be reenacted forever. Where earlier kings had been buried in imposing but low-lying structures, Djoser's monument rose visibly against the horizon, linking earth and sky in a way that must have been striking to anyone approaching from the Nile Valley. The decision to build in stone on such a scale was also a powerful statement about resources and control. Only a central authority with access to large amounts of labor, skilled craftsmen, and quarries could have undertaken such a project and seen it through to completion. The technical and logistical challenges involved are difficult to overstate. Stone had been used before for certain elements of temples and tombs, but never in such vast quantities. Blocks had to be quarried, transported, and precisely arranged. Imhotep and his teams developed methods for cutting and fitting the limestone, aligning the structure, and organizing the work so that thousands of laborers could contribute without chaos. Based on what we know from later pyramid sites and workers' settlements, many researchers think that the workforce drew on Egyptians from across the country, mobilized on a seasonal basis when the Nile flood limited agricultural work. In return for their labor, workers were housed, fed, and integrated into a project that, from the state's perspective, reinforced both central authority and a shared sense of participating in something larger than everyday life. Djoser's step pyramid set a precedent that his successors refined and expanded. In the following fourth dynasty, one king in particular, Sneferu, seems to have experimented repeatedly with pyramid forms and construction techniques. At Maydum, south of Saqqara, there stands a structure that began as a step pyramid and was later converted into a smooth-sided form. Nearby, at Dashur, two more large pyramids are associated with Sneferu, the so-called bent pyramid, which changes angle partway up, and the red pyramid, whose smooth sides meet at a single point. The bent pyramid's unusual shape has inspired many explanations. One common view is that the builders altered the angle during construction to reduce structural stress when cracks appeared in the casing and internal chambers. If that interpretation is correct, the monument records, in stone, the process of learning how to build on a scale and in a material that pushed existing techniques to their limits. By the time Sneferu's experiments were complete, the essential form of the true pyramid had been mastered. 4 triangular faces meeting at a point, rising from a square base, carefully aligned to the cardinal directions. This achievement set the stage for the best-known monuments of ancient Egypt, constructed under Sneferu's successors at a site slightly north of Saqqara, on a plateau at Giza. There, 3 kings of the 4th dynasty, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, built pyramids that would become famous as one of the great wonders of the ancient world. Khufu's pyramid, the largest of the 3, originally stood at about 146 meters high, its sides encased in smooth white Tura limestone that would have reflected the sunlight sharply. Its internal structure includes ascending passages, chambers, and relieving spaces designed to distribute the immense weight of stone above. To the east and west, rows of mastaba tombs for royal family members and high officials form a cemetery linked symbolically and physically to the king's burial. Nearby, boat pits contained dismantled wooden vessels, perhaps intended to carry the king in the afterlife, either along the sky as the sun's companion or along the divine Nile. Khafre's slightly smaller pyramid stands on higher ground, with a still impressive casing near its summit and an associated valley temple connected by a causeway. Between his pyramid and the river, carved directly from the bedrock, lies the Great Sphinx, a recumbent lion with a royal head, often thought to represent Khafre himself. Menkaure, the 3rd of the Giza kings, built a smaller pyramid, but surrounded it with an elaborate complex, including subsidiary pyramids and richly decorated valley buildings. Standing back, what we see at Giza is not just 3 isolated monuments, but a planned landscape dedicated to the idea of royal eternity. Each pyramid is paired with a mortuary temple near its base, linked by a causeway to a valley temple closer to the floodplain. In these temples, priests and officials carried out rituals to sustain the king's soul. Offerings of food, incense, and drink, recitations of formulaic texts, and commemorative ceremonies. The pyramid itself, rising above, was both tomb and symbol, a sign of the king's transformation from a mortal ruler into an enduring, semi-divine presence. For those living in the villages around Giza or sailing along the nearby Nile, these structures would have served as constant reminders of the scale of royal power and the promise of order it claimed to uphold. The construction of such complexes required more than raw labor. It depended on an administrative network capable of coordinating quarrying, transport, provisioning, and skilled craftsmanship over many years. In the 4th dynasty, titles recorded on tomb walls and in inscriptions include overseers of works, chiefs of quarries, scribes of the king's documents, and managers of royal estates. These officials often built their own tombs in the shadow of the pyramids they helped create, carving on their walls scenes of daily life, processions of offerings, and lists of their titles. In these images and inscriptions, we get a glimpse of how the pyramid age looked from within, a world in which serving the king and the state was not only a duty, but also a source of status and remembrance. For the broader population, the pyramid projects likely meant periodic service away from home. Evidence from workers' villages at later sites, including the town near the Giza plateau, examined by modern excavations, shows well-organized housing, bakeries, breweries, and areas interpreted as facilities for treating injuries for those involved in the building and maintenance of royal monuments. Skeletal remains suggest that many workers, though subject to physical strain, received treatment for injuries and adequate diets while on duty. Taken together, this has led many scholars to argue that, while the state demanded significant labor, it also took practical steps to sustain those who served. From this, it is reasonable to assume that participation in such projects was experienced as a mixture of obligation, opportunity, and shared identity, reinforcing a sense that many Egyptians had a place, however modest, in the wider enterprise of maintaining Mad under the guidance of the king. At the same time, the system that made pyramid building possible rested on a delicate balance. The central government needed to extract surplus from the countryside, grain, livestock, and other goods to support the royal court, temples, and monumental projects. To do this effectively, it relied on provincial officials, often called nomarchs, who administered districts known as nomes. These nomarchs collected taxes, oversaw irrigation works, and judged local disputes. In the early Old Kingdom, their authority derived directly from the king, and their loyalty seems, on the whole, to have been secure. Their tombs, where they could afford them, often echoed royal styles on a smaller scale, celebrating both their service to the monarch and their role as local patrons. Religious ideas about kingship also deepened during this period. The king was increasingly associated with the sun god, who rose and set each day, yet remained constant, giving light and life to the world. The pyramid's shape, some have suggested, may recall the rays of the sun or the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at the dawn of creation. This interpretation grows out of later theological texts and artistic conventions rather than direct statements from Djoser's time. Whether or not these links were consciously articulated in the earliest pyramids, Old Kingdom texts from slightly later periods make explicit connections between the king's fate and the solar cycle. After death, the king was imagined as ascending to the sky, joining the imperishable stars, or traveling across the heavens with the sun god. The pyramid, towering over the western desert, the region of sunset and death, became a fitting architectural metaphor for this celestial journey. As the fourth dynasty gave way to the fifth and sixth, royal monuments changed in scale and emphasis. Later kings built smaller pyramids than their great predecessors at Giza, but developed more elaborate temple complexes and a richer liturgical life around them. In the pyramid complexes of kings such as Unas and Pepi II, for example, inscriptions known as the pyramid texts were carved on the walls of the burial chambers. These texts consist of spells, hymns, and ritual statements intended to guide and protect the king in the afterlife. Their presence marks a new stage in the use of writing, no longer confined to labels and brief formulae. Hieroglyphs now recorded extended religious compositions, preserving not just names and titles, but entire bodies of ritual speech. Beyond Memphis and the pyramid fields, the Old Kingdom saw the spread of Egyptian influence and culture along the Nile and into neighboring regions. In Nubia to the south, Egyptian expeditions sought gold, copper, and other resources, leaving fortifications, graffiti, and imported goods in their wake. To the northeast, contacts with Sinai and the Levant provided access to turquoise, copper, and timber. Trade with distant lands brought in not only materials, but also ideas, although Egypt's strong sense of its own order meant that foreign influences were usually adapted cautiously and integrated into existing frameworks rather than overturning them. The king, as the axis of this system, was presented as the one who maintained balance between Egypt and the outside world, receiving tribute, commanding expeditions, and ensuring that the flow of goods served the needs of the gods and the people. For a time, the Old Kingdom arrangement seemed remarkably stable. Kings ruled from Memphis. Pyramids rose along the western desert cliffs. Provincial nomarchs administered their nomes, and the rhythms of flood and harvest went on as they had for generations. In tomb scenes of officials and nobles, we see serene images of agriculture, hunting, banqueting, and craft production, with little hint of turmoil. Yet, beneath this calm surface, certain pressures were gradually building. As generations passed, provincial elites accumulated more land and local authority, sometimes turning their offices into quasi-hereditary positions. Maintaining large court establishments and frequent building projects placed ongoing demands on the state's resources. Occasional low Nile floods, if they occurred in succession, could strain the system of redistribution and put stress on both royal and local administrations. Later Egyptian tradition would remember the end of the Old Kingdom as a time of fragmentation and hardship, a period when the land was in great affliction and the poor turned against the rich. Modern research suggests that the process was more complex and drawn out than a single sudden collapse. Still, the combination of environmental stress, rising provincial autonomy, and possible weaknesses in the central government appears to have eroded the tight control that Fourth Dynasty kings had exercised. As the sixth dynasty drew to a close, the long reign of Pepi II and the competing claims of local rulers seemed to have set the stage for an age when the vision of a single, unassailable center would be tested severely. For now, though, in the glow of the Old Kingdom, it is enough to picture the sun setting behind the pyramids, casting long shadows across the desert, while priests perform their rituals in the cool interiors of mortuary temples, and villagers along the Nile prepare their evening meals under the fading light. Egypt had achieved a level of political and architectural integration that few earlier societies had matched. Its kings had inscribed their ambitions into stone on a colossal scale, and woven those monuments into the religious, and so those changes began to show themselves first not in dramatic collapses, but in small shifts of emphasis in the balance between center and provinces, in the way wealth and power were distributed, and perhaps in the rhythm of the Nile itself. In the later Old Kingdom, especially under the long reign of Pepi II in the 6th dynasty, provincial officials gained increasing autonomy. Their tombs, carved into cliffs far from Memphis, or raised as large mastabas in regional cemeteries, grew more elaborate. Inscriptions on their walls record their titles, their local achievements, and sometimes their pride in the benefits they brought to their own districts. The king remained the supreme figure in theory, but in practice, these local elites were becoming more like small-scale rulers in their own domains. At the same time, the central administration had to support a complex court, maintain temples, and oversee the continued construction and upkeep of royal monuments. All of this demanded resources: grain to feed officials and workers, livestock for offerings, materials for building and craft production. If a series of low Nile floods reduced harvests, the strain on the system could become acute. Later texts that look back on this era, such as the admonitions of Ipuwer and other pessimistic literature, describe a world turned upside down: famine, social disorder, the rich becoming poor, and the poor rising up. These compositions were written centuries after the Old Kingdom and are stylized, so they cannot be read as straightforward historical reports. But they do hint that Egyptians of later times remembered the end of the Old Kingdom as a period when the old order faltered, the center weakened, and provincial powers asserted themselves more boldly. Archaeological evidence supports the idea of gradual fragmentation rather than a single, catastrophic collapse. Royal monuments after Pepi II become smaller and less impressive. Some planned works may have been left incomplete. In the provinces, by contrast, the tombs of nomarchs and other local leaders continue to display confidence and wealth. Inscriptions speak of these men organizing food relief during hard times, defending their people against raiders, and managing irrigation works. It seems that as the authority of the king diminished, local communities increasingly looked to their own leaders for protection and stability. The land was still Egypt, with the same river, the same villages, and the same gods. But the sense of a single, unifying royal presence was blurring. Historians refer to the period that followed the Old Kingdom as the First Intermediate Period, roughly spanning the 7th to early 11th dynasties. The label intermediate reflects a later perspective. It marks a time between great centralized states, rather than implying that nothing significant happened. In reality, this was an era of experimentation and regional dynamism. Different centers claimed royal titles, issued decrees, and erected their own monuments. In the north, around the area of Heracleopolis Magna, a line of kings now called the 9th and 10th dynasties held sway over parts of Lower and Middle Egypt. In the south, Thebes, a city that had been relatively minor in earlier times, emerged as the base for a rival house that would eventually call itself the 11th dynasty. For people living through this time, loyalties and identities likely felt more local, bound to city and region as much as to any overarching royal institution. A farmer near Heracleopolis might interact regularly with officials sent from that city, pay taxes into its granaries, and invoke the names of its kings in formal contexts. A scribe in Thebes, by contrast, would serve a different court, use a different set of royal names, and be drawn into southern projects. Trade and communication along the Nile did not cease, but the tone and framework within which they took place shifted. Instead of seeing themselves as subjects of a single throne at Memphis, Egyptians in this period lived under a patchwork of overlapping claims and negotiated relationships. Conflict between these regional powers is mentioned in later literary texts, such as the so-called instruction for King Merikare, which is framed as advice from a Heracleopolitan ruler to his son. In it, the older king recalls earlier unrest, warns against unjust rule, and speaks of the dangers of alienating the people. The text is didactic and idealized, but it captures something of the atmosphere of an age in which rulers were keenly aware that their hold on power depended on both effective administration and moral presentation. We hear of attacks on towns, the burning of fields, and the need to win back loyalty through generosity and justice. Even if the details are shaped for teaching purposes, the underlying concern with fractured authority rings true for the First Intermediate Period. Meanwhile, in Thebes, the southern dynasty gradually extended its reach northward. Rulers such as Intef II and Intef III took the titles and regalia of kings, not just local governors, and built modest royal tombs on the west bank of the Nile. Their inscriptions emphasize control over Upper Egypt, and sometimes speak of conflicts with Heracleopolitan forces to the north. The highland terrain of the Theban region, with its cliffs and narrow river valley, may have offered both defensive advantages and a sense of distinct identity. The Theban god Amun, whose cult was still developing at this time, would later become central to the Egyptian pantheon. Already, his local importance gave Thebes a religious as well as political claim to prominence. The decisive figure in ending this period of division was Nebhipeter Mentuhotep II, a Theban king of the 11th dynasty. Over the course of a long reign, he gradually defeated rival claimants, reasserted authority over Middle and Lower Egypt, and reunited the two lands. Later king lists and inscriptions remember him as a restorer, a unifier who brought peace after strife. His mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahri, on the west bank opposite modern Luxor, reflects this ambition. It combines elements of a terraced temple with a royal tomb, set against the dramatic backdrop of cliffs that rise almost sheer from the desert floor. The complex's design, with courtyards, colonnades, and ramps, looks forward to later New Kingdom constructions in the same area, suggesting that Mentuhotep's architects were experimenting with new ways of linking royal burial, temple ritual, and the natural landscape. Mentuhotep II's reunification marked the beginning of what we call the Middle Kingdom, often dated from the latter part of the 11th dynasty through the 12th, and in some schemes, the 13th. In this era, Egypt regained a measure of the political unity and administrative coherence that had characterized the Old Kingdom, but with some important differences in tone and emphasis. The experience of fragmentation seems to have left a lasting mark. Middle Kingdom texts and monuments often convey a heightened concern with just governance, the responsibilities of officials, and the fragility of order. The ideal of mad truth, balance, and rightness was still tied to the person of the king, but its practical realization now involved a more self-conscious bureaucracy and a more reflective literary tradition. After Mentuhotep's line faded, a new family rose to power and founded the 12th dynasty. The first king of this house, Amenemhat I, moved the royal residence to a new location, probably in the region of the Fayum, a fertile depression west of the Nile Valley. The exact site of this new capital has not yet been securely identified, but most scholars place it near the royal cemeteries at Lisht. The new capital, whose Egyptian name is usually rendered as Ichtoi, put the court in a position that was central both to the valley and to the approaches to the western oases. Amenemhat I's decision to relocate may have been strategic, signaling a fresh start after the regionalism of the first intermediate period and allowing closer oversight of key agricultural and communication zones. The 12th dynasty kings built pyramids of their own, though on a smaller scale than the giants of the 4th dynasty, and often using mud brick cores sheathed in stone. Sites such as Lisht, Dashur, and Al-Lahun preserve the remains of these complexes, surrounded by cemeteries for officials and worker settlements. The layout of these royal projects suggests that the Middle Kingdom revived the Old Kingdom pattern of integrating tombs, temples, and administrative activity. But with adjustments, the king's residence was now closer to the center of the country, and more attention seems to have been paid to irrigation and land management projects, especially in the Fayum, where canals and embankments expanded the cultivable area. One of the most distinctive features of the Middle Kingdom is its literature. While earlier periods had produced ritual texts and brief inscriptions, the Middle Kingdom saw the flourishing of extended compositions copied on papyri and ostraca, tales such as the story of Sinu, in which a courtier flees Egypt and lives among foreigners before returning home, explore themes of loyalty, identity, and the pull of the homeland. Instruction texts, framed as advice from a father to a son or a king to his heir, set out ideals of behavior for officials: moderation, fairness, attentiveness to the needs of subordinates. Reflective works, such as the Dialogue of a Man and his Ba, confront questions of suffering, despair, and the value of life. These texts do not give us statistics or chronicles, but they do open a window onto how some educated Egyptians of the time thought about their world, aware of its uncertainties, conscious of their responsibilities, and deeply attached to the notion of order as something that must be actively maintained. Administratively, the Middle Kingdom rulers appear to have walked a careful line between centralization and delegation. They relied on viziers, treasurers, and overseers of fields, granaries, and estates to manage the complex flow of resources. At the same time, they tried to keep provincial elites from becoming too independent. Some nomarchal lines continued to build impressive tombs in their home districts, but there are signs that royal policy at times curtailed their power, either by rotating officials or by drawing them more tightly into court life. The aim, it seems, was to harness local expertise without allowing another wave of centrifugal forces like those that had fractured Egypt after the Old Kingdom. Beyond Egypt's borders, Middle Kingdom kings pursued a more systematic policy of expansion and control, especially to the south. Fortresses built along the Nile in Lower Nubia, with massive walls, barracks, and storage facilities, anchored Egyptian presence in a region rich in gold, cattle, and trade routes. Inscriptions from these sites record expeditions, tribute, and the movement of goods and people. To the northeast, contacts with the Levant continued, bringing timber, metals, and other resources into Egypt. As in earlier periods, foreign lands were seen both as sources of wealth and as zones of potential instability. The king's role included safeguarding Egypt's frontiers, projecting an image of strength that reassured his own people and discouraged would-be challengers. For ordinary Egyptians, much in daily life remained familiar across these changes in dynasties and capitals. Farmers still planted crops in the wake of the flood, tended livestock, and paid their dues in produce or labor. Artisans worked in stone, wood, metal, and faience, producing tools, jewelry, and household items as well as the statues and reliefs that adorned temples and tombs. Family structures, religious festivals, and local cults continued, even as royal names and policy priorities shifted. Middle Kingdom tomb art, however, often shows a more detailed and naturalistic treatment of scenes from everyday life: cattle herding, fishing, weaving, and craftwork, depicted with a vividness that some modern viewers find especially engaging. These images, carved and painted to ensure prosperity in the afterlife, also testify to the importance of ordinary activities in the Egyptian imagination of a well-ordered existence. In the cemeteries and temples of the Middle Kingdom, we sense both continuity and a subtle deepening of self-awareness. Officials praise the kings they serve, but they also emphasize their own actions: how they fed the hungry in times of shortage, how they judged fairly, how they respected the gods and cared for their households. The memory of earlier breakdowns seems to hover in the background, giving weight to virtues like generosity and justice. Egypt had been divided once and brought back together at great cost. Those hints of future instability did not immediately overturn the world that Middle Kingdom kings had built. For a time, Egypt under the 12th dynasty remained a coherent, well-governed state, its canals maintained, its fortresses in Nubia supplied, its scribes busy with accounts and instructions. But like the Old Kingdom before it, this order rested on conditions that could shift slowly, and then, at certain moments, more abruptly. Changes in the flow of the Nile, pressures from neighboring peoples, and internal strains in the royal house all played a part in bringing the Middle Kingdom to an end and ushering in a new phase of fragmentation and renewal. The transition from the 12th to the 13th dynasty was not marked by a single dramatic event. Instead, the royal line seems to have become more crowded and less stable. Kings followed one another in relatively quick succession, some reigning only a short time. Their names survive on scarabs, stelae, and later king lists, but few are associated with large, ambitious building projects on the scale of their 12th dynasty predecessors. This pattern could suggest that the central authority in the later Middle Kingdom was weakening, whether because of dynastic disputes, economic stresses, or both. At the same time, evidence from the Eastern Delta indicates that groups of people from the Levant, whom the Egyptians often referred to generically as Asiatics, were settling in increasing numbers in that region, some as laborers or traders, others as local rulers controlling small towns and estates. As the 13th dynasty's grip loosened, local powers in the Delta and further north along the Mediterranean coast seem to have asserted themselves more strongly. One of these northern houses, later known in king lists as the 14th dynasty, may have ruled parts of the Eastern Delta independently, while the 13th dynasty still existed in the south. Over time, this mosaic of overlapping authorities became more complex. Into this environment of divided rule and foreign presence, stepped a group of rulers whom later Egyptian tradition would call the Hyksos, probably from an Egyptian phrase meaning rulers of foreign lands. They established their center at a city in the northeastern delta, known to us as Avaris, and came to control much of northern Egypt. The exact origins of the Hyksos kings are still debated, but the material culture of Avaris shows strong links to the Levant. Pottery styles, weapons, and religious practices found there resemble those of contemporaneous Canaanite cities. On scarabs and monuments, Hyksos rulers used some Egyptian royal titles and iconography, but they also invoked deities such as the storm god Baal, whom Egyptian texts sometimes equated with their own god Seth. This combination of elements suggests that the Hyksos were not a wholly external invading army imposed on an unsuspecting Egypt in a single campaign, but rather the result of a gradual process in which foreign elites already established in the Delta were able, in a time of central weakness, to claim royal status and expand their control. The period in which the Hyksos held sway over the north, while native Egyptian dynasties continued to rule in the south, is known as the Second Intermediate Period. It followed a familiar pattern. Once again, the unity of the two lands broke into overlapping zones of power. In Thebes, local rulers formed what we now call the 17th dynasty, controlling Upper Egypt and presenting themselves as the legitimate heirs of earlier pharaohs. They continued to worship traditional gods such as Amun and Re, maintained court rituals, and buried their kings in modest but dignified tombs along the west bank of the Nile. To the north, in the Hyksos realm, Avaris became the hub of an economy connected to the wider eastern Mediterranean, with trade links stretching to Cyprus, Syria, and beyond. Contact between these spheres was not purely hostile. There must have been trade, diplomatic exchanges, and shared concerns about other neighbors. But the existence of a powerful foreign dynasty on Egyptian soil, controlling the rich farmlands and strategic approaches of the Delta, was a standing challenge to Theban pride and ambition. Over time, Theban rulers began to frame their struggle against the Hyksos in ideological as well as political terms. In later inscriptions, they described themselves as liberators, driving out foreign oppressors and restoring proper order to the land. These texts were composed with hindsight and rhetorical purpose, but they reflect a real sense that the presence of Hyksos kings in Egypt was unacceptable to Theban elites, who defined themselves through adherence to traditional cults and royal ideals. One of the first Theban rulers to act decisively against the Hyksos was a king named Seqenenre-Tau, sometimes called Seqenenre-Tau II. His mummy, discovered in the 19th century, bears severe head wounds, leading many scholars to conclude that he died in battle or was killed in a violent confrontation. Stories preserved in later literature tell of provocative demands by the Hyksos king and Seqenenre's indignant response, casting their conflict as a clash between a bullying foreign ruler and a courageous, but initially outmatched Theban king. Whether these details are precise or embroidered, the physical evidence of Seqenenr's injuries points to a period of real fighting between north and south. Seqenenr's successor, Kamose, continued this aggressive policy. In inscriptions on stelae from Thebes, Kamose boasts of leading campaigns northward, attacking Hyksos-held towns and disrupting their supply lines. He describes himself as a champion of Egypt, motivated by outrage that a foreign king should share the land with him. The rhetoric is heated, but beneath it, we can glimpse strategic efforts to weaken the Hyksos' hold on the country by targeting isolated garrisons and cutting off communications. Kamos's actions did not immediately end Hyksos' control of the delta, but they set the stage for a final push. That decisive phase came under the rule of Ahmose, a Theban king who is traditionally regarded as the founder of the 18th dynasty and the New Kingdom. Building on the work of his predecessors, Ahmose reorganized his forces and launched campaigns that eventually captured Avaris and drove Hyksos' power out of Egypt proper. In autobiographical inscriptions from the tombs of soldiers and officers who served under him, we read of battles in the delta, sieges of fortified towns, and pursuit of fleeing enemies into southern Palestine. These accounts are naturally written to glorify the king and his loyal followers, but they confirm that Ahmose's victories were not simply symbolic. They involved real warfare, with rewards in land, slaves, and prestige for participants. With the expulsion of the Hyksos and the reassertion of control over the delta, Egypt was once again unified under a native royal house. But the experiences of the second intermediate period had changed the kingdom's horizons. The Hyksos had shown how vulnerable the delta could be to influences from the northeast, and how easily a powerful entity in southern Canaan could threaten Egyptian interests. They had also brought with them technologies that Egyptians adopted and adapted, including more extensive use of the horse-drawn chariot and certain styles of weapons, such as composite bows and new axe forms. In response, New Kingdom rulers developed a more hardened, professional military apparatus than earlier periods had possessed, with standing units, specialized chariot corps, and clearer structures of rank and reward. Under Ahmose and his immediate successors, Amenhotep I, Thutmose I, and Thutmose II, Egypt moved from a defensive posture to a more active, expansionist one. Campaigns pushed south into Nubia, reasserting and extending control beyond the old Middle Kingdom frontier fortresses. New forts and administrative centers were established further upriver, turning large parts of Nubia into a combination of province and extraction zone, rich in gold and other resources. To the northeast, Egyptian armies advanced into southern Syria and Palestine, taking key towns and enforcing loyalty among local rulers. In this way, the New Kingdom kings sought to create a buffer of dependent territories between Egypt and the great powers of the Near East. The most dramatic phase of this expansion came under Thutmose III, who ruled for many years, first in the shadow of his stepmother and co-regent Hatshepsut, and then on his own. After Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose led a series of campaigns into the Levant, famously including a battle near the city of Megiddo. Egyptian accounts describe how he marched his forces along a narrow, risky route to surprise a coalition of Canaanite princes, and then laid siege to the city until it surrendered. The details are shaped by royal scribes to highlight the king's boldness and skill. But the overall pattern is clear. Repeated expeditions, sieges of resisting towns, and a gradual imposition of Egyptian authority over a wide arc of territory reaching into modern Syria. In the wake of these campaigns, Egypt found itself at the head of what we can reasonably call an empire. Local rulers in Canaan and Syria continued to govern their own cities, but they now did so as vassals, sending tribute to Egypt and, in some cases, hostages to the royal court. Garrisons of Egyptian troops occupied strategic points, and royal officials known as overseers of foreign lands managed communications and resource flows. From these territories came not only gold and silver, but also copper, timber, wine, and horses. The wealth that poured into Egypt during the 18th dynasty fueled an unprecedented wave of building and artistic production at home. At Thebes, now the ceremonial heart of the kingdom, the temple of Amun-Re at Karnak grew into a sprawling complex of pylons, courtyards, halls, and obelisks. Each king added his own structures and inscriptions, presenting himself as the chosen of Amun, who had granted him victory abroad and abundance at home. The relationship between king and god was framed as reciprocal. The god gave power and legitimacy. The king repaid this favor with lavish offerings, festivals, and architectural embellishments. Over time, the priesthood of Amun, which controlled the temple's estates and offerings, became a major economic and political force in its own right, holding land and resources across Egypt. The new kingdom's prosperity was not confined to Thebes. At Memphis and other northern centers, temples of Ptah and other deities received their own share of royal attention. Elite tombs in places like Saqqara and the Theban necropolis show officials proudly recording their service on foreign campaigns, their roles in temple administration, and the honors they received from the king. Scenes on their tomb walls depict bustling workshops, agricultural estates, and long processions of tribute from abroad. Syrians bringing horses and chariots, Nubians bearing gold rings and exotic animals, and other foreigners carrying carved vessels, fragrant woods, and elaborate furnishings. These images, while idealized, reflect a genuine influx of foreign goods and people into Egyptian society. Amid this wealth and expansion, The daily life of most Egyptians still revolved around the familiar cycles of the Nile. Farmers planted and harvested, paid taxes, and supplied labor for state projects. Craftsmen and artisans worked in increasingly specialized settings, producing luxury goods as well as ordinary tools. Soldiers, scribes, and administrators formed a growing stratum of professionals whose careers depended on the functioning of the imperial system. For some, foreign service offered opportunities for advancement. A successful campaign could bring not only plunder, but also promotion, land grants, and a place in the royal record. The experiences of the second intermediate period lingered in memory as a cautionary tale. New kingdom kings took care to present themselves as vigilant defenders of Egypt against chaos from abroad. In monumental inscriptions, they boasted of crushing rebels in Nubia, defeating coalitions in Syria, and forcing distant kings to send tribute. At the same time, diplomatic relations with other great powers of the late Bronze Age, the Hittites, Mitanni, Babylonia, took on a more formal character. Letters preserved on clay tablets from sites such as Amarna, which would become important in a later phase of the story, show Egyptian kings exchanging gifts and courteous messages with their peers, marrying foreign princesses, and negotiating from a position of acknowledged strength. For a time, this system seemed to hold. Egypt enjoyed the fruits of its empire: gold to gild temple statues and furnishings, cedar for shipbuilding and monumental doors, lapis and other stones for jewelry, and a stream of goods and people that kept its port towns lively. The temples of Amun, Re, Ptah, and other gods flourished. The royal palaces hosted ceremonies that linked political power with divine favor. To many observers within Egypt, it must have appeared that the kingdom had entered a new golden age, in which the vulnerabilities exposed by the Hyksos interlude had been not only repaired, but to cite those currents between royal authority, religious tradition, and everyday practice came together most dramatically in the reign of one new kingdom ruler, whose decisions would reshape Egypt's religious landscape and leave traces that still provoke argument today. By the time he came to the throne, the kingdom had enjoyed generations of wealth and success. Temples were rich, especially those of Amun at Thebes. Kings were victorious abroad and lavish at home, praised in inscriptions as beloved of the gods and benefactors of their people. Yet the very prosperity of this system had begun to create tensions within it. Temple estates controlled large tracts of land and vast herds. Priests oversaw the flow of offerings and endowments, becoming major economic actors in their own right. The king remained, in principle, the supreme intermediary between gods and humans, but he now shared the stage with institutions that had their own interests and rhythms. The ruler under whom these tensions took on a new shape was Amenhotep III, a king whose long reign marked one of the high points of New Kingdom civilization. He inherited the empire built by his predecessors and presided over a period of relative peace in which diplomacy and display took precedence over large-scale warfare. His court orchestrated festivals, diplomatic marriages, and building programs on an impressive scale. At Thebes, he embellished the temple of Amun at Karnak and built a vast mortuary temple on the west bank, of which the so-called colossi of Memnon, two enormous seated statues, still stand as sentinels over the fields. Inscriptions and diplomatic correspondence from his time show a king who spoke confidently with other great rulers of the Near East, exchanging gifts of gold, fine textiles, and luxury goods. Religiously, Amenhotep III maintained traditional cults, but he also showed a particular interest in the solar aspect of divinity. The sun god, long associated with Re and increasingly linked with Amun in the combined figure of Amun-Re, appears in his monuments and inscriptions with growing emphasis. Aten, a term that could be used to refer to the visible disk of the sun, features more prominently as an object of praise. Based on what we know from surviving hymns and temple scenes, this does not seem to have been a rejection of other gods. Rather, it suggests a deepening fascination with the life-giving power of the sun, expressed within the existing framework of Egyptian polytheism. It was under his successor, however, that this focus became something far more radical. Amenhotep III's son, who came to the throne as Amenhotep IV, began his reign in a relatively conventional way, honoring Amun and other major deities. Soon, though, he began to accord extraordinary prominence to the Aten. He sponsored open-air temples focused on the sun disk, with offering tables exposed to direct light and reliefs, showing the Aten's rays ending in tiny hands that extended Ankh signs, symbols of life, to the royal family. Within a few years, he changed his name from Amenhotep, which meant Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, signaling a formal break with the cult of Amun and a new, more exclusive devotion to the Aten. The precise motives behind Akhenaten's religious revolution remain debated. Some scholars see it as driven by genuine theological conviction, a belief that the Aten, as the visible sun, was the sole true God, making all others obsolete or false. Others emphasize political and economic factors, suggesting that by elevating a deity with no established priesthood or temple network, Akhenaten could undercut the power of Amun's priests and re-centralize religious authority in his own person on the basis of his hymns and royal titles. Many scholars argue that he presented himself not just as a pious king, but as the unique interpreter of Aten's will, the one through whom the god could be most fully known. Taken together, this combination of evidence makes it reasonable to think that both conviction and calculation played a role in his program. One of Akhenaten's most dramatic moves was the founding of a new capital city, built in a previously undeveloped stretch of the Nile Valley between Thebes and Memphis. He called this city Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten. Modern archaeologists know it as Amarna. There, in a broad bay of cliffs that seemed to frame the rising sun, boundary stelae were carved into the rock, proclaiming that Aten had chosen this place and that Akhenaten would rule from it in accordance with the god's desire. Within a short span of years, a full capital took shape. Royal palaces, temples dedicated to the Aten, administrative buildings, warehouses, and residential quarters for officials, craftsmen, and laborers. Excavations at Amarna reveal a bustling urban center, laid out with some planning, but also with the improvisations of daily life, streets, neighborhoods, workshops, and cemeteries. In this new setting, Akhenaten's religious program reached its most intense expression. The Aten was praised in official hymns as the sole creator and sustainer of life, whose light made plants grow, animals thrive, and humans prosper across all lands, Egyptian and foreign alike. Other gods were marginalized, or in some cases, actively suppressed. Amun's name and images were hacked out of monuments, his temples neglected or closed. Traditional festivals centered on multiple deities seem to have been curtailed or redirected. In reliefs, the royal family Akhenaten, his queen Nefertiti, and their daughters appears constantly beneath the rays of the Aten, receiving life directly from the god. Ordinary worshippers, when depicted, stand behind or below the royal figures, a pattern that many modern interpreters take to suggest that access to the divine was imagined as running primarily through the king and his immediate household. Art from the Amarna period reflects this shift in mood and emphasis. Instead of the highly idealized, somewhat rigid forms that had characterized much of earlier New Kingdom art, we see elongated heads, narrow faces, rounded bellies, and fluid poses. Scenes show the royal family in surprisingly intimate settings, playing with their children, embracing, or dining together under the Aten's rays. Scholars debate how literally these images should be taken as reflections of actual appearance or behavior. Some suggest that the new style was symbolic, emphasizing fertility, vitality, and the special, almost otherworldly status of the king and his family. Others think that there may have been an element of realism, perhaps influenced by changes in workshop practice. Whatever its precise meaning, the Amarna style marked a sharp break with tradition, mirroring the theological break that Akhenaten sought to impose. For many Egyptians, especially outside the inner circles of court and temple, these changes likely felt bewildering. Local cults and festivals had long provided the framework for communal identity, marking agricultural rhythms, life transitions, and shared memories. The abrupt downgrading or erasure of beloved gods, the redirection of offerings, and the insistence that one distant city and one royal family now held the key to proper worship, could only have altered the religious landscape in unsettling ways. We do not have direct testimony from ordinary villagers about their reactions, but the later eagerness with which temples to the old gods were restored suggests that Akhenaten's reforms did not fully capture the hearts of the wider population. Even within the elite, signs of strain are visible. Correspondence from foreign courts during Akhenaten's reign indicates that some vassal rulers in Canaan and Syria felt neglected or insecure, appealing for military support that was slow or insufficient. At home, the concentration of resources on building and maintaining Akhetaten and Aten temples may have diverted attention and manpower from traditional power centers. It is possible that the abruptness of the religious shift, combined with external pressures on the empire, weakened the delicate balance that previous New Kingdom kings had maintained between ideology, administration, and force. The final years of Akhenaten's rule and the succession that followed are among the murkiest episodes in Egyptian history. There are hints of a co-regent, possibly a figure named Smenkhkare, who may have shared power with Akhenaten briefly or taken the throne after him. The identity and exact role of this ruler remain subjects of lively debate. What is clearer is that within a short time of Akhenaten's death, the Aten-focused experiment began to be rolled back. A young king, originally named Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, signaling a restored favor toward the Theban god. Under Tutankhamun and his advisors, older figures such as Ai and Hormheb, the court moved away from Akhetaten and back toward traditional centers like Memphis and Thebes. Temples to Amun, Ptah, and other gods were reopened and repaired. Inscriptions from this period, especially Tutankhamun's restoration stela, describe the land as having been in disorder under the previous regime, with temples neglected and cults disrupted, and they celebrate the restoration of proper worship. Statues and names of Akhenaten were defaced or removed, his monuments dismantled, and his memory officially condemned. Based on what we know from these later texts, and from the archaeological abandonment of Amarna, we can say with some confidence that the Aten-focused regime was not just quietly set aside, but actively repudiated. Tutankhamun himself died young, leaving behind a tomb in the Valley of the Kings that, by the fortunes of history, would survive into modern times more intact than most others. When it was opened in the early 20th century, the richness of its contents, gilded shrines, a solid gold coffin, jewelry, chariots, furniture, and everyday items, gave the world a vivid, if exceptional, glimpse of New Kingdom royal life. For ancient Egyptians, though, Tutankhamun's significance likely lay less in the splendor of his burial than in his role as a figure of transition, under whose name the old gods returned to prominence, and the memory of Akhenaten's revolution began to fade under layers of official disapproval. After Tutankhamun, power passed to Ai, an elderly courtier who took the throne for a brief period, and then to Hormheb, a career military commander. Hormheb, though not of royal blood, presented himself as the legitimate heir who would restore Egypt fully after the disruptions of the Amarna era. His decrees include measures aimed at curbing corruption and ensuring that temple and state revenues were properly managed, suggesting both a desire for moral renewal and a practical effort to tighten control over resources. In his inscriptions, he linked himself back to earlier respected kings, effectively writing Akhenaten and his immediate successors out of the official narrative. In dynastic terms, Hormheb stands at the hinge between two phases of the new kingdom. Having no surviving sons, he chose a military officer named Paramesu as his successor. This man would take the throne name Ramesses I and found the 19th dynasty. With him and his descendants, Egypt would enter an era dominated by rulers whose names still echo strongly in popular memory. Kings like Seti I and Ramesses II, who would lead campaigns on a grand scale, carve their images deep into the stone of temples, and negotiate, fight, and cooperate with the other great powers of the late Bronze Age. For the moment, however, at the close of the 18th dynasty, Egypt was once again attempting to steady itself after a period of ideological upheaval. The Aten episode had shown how far a determined king could push religious change, but it had also revealed the limits of such an experiment in a society whose fabric was woven from many local traditions and long-standing cult. That new chapter unfolded first under the brief reign of Ramesses I, and then more fully under his son Seti I and his grandson Ramesses II, whose names would come to stand for the ambition and confidence of the Ramesside age. Ramesses I ruled only a short time, but his accession marked the formal start of the 19th dynasty and the consolidation of the arrangements Hormheb had put in place. The machinery of empire was back in the hands of experienced soldiers and administrators. Campaign routes into Syria and Nubia were well known. Fortresses along the Nile were provisioned and repaired, and the great temples at Thebes and Memphis were once again at the center of royal display. It fell to Seti I to give this restored kingdom a more tangible shape, both in stone and in military action. Seti I, whose throne name can be translated as He of Set, beloved of Ptah, was an active military ruler. Reliefs on temple walls depict him leading campaigns into Syria-Palestine, battling enemies in Canaan, and reasserting Egyptian influence over towns and trade routes that had wavered during the later 18th dynasty. To the south, he strengthened control in Nubia, ensuring that gold and other resources continued to flow north. At the same time, he was a builder of impressive monuments. At Karnak, he began work on parts of the great hypostyle hall, with its forest of towering columns covered in carved scenes and inscriptions. At Abydos, he commissioned a beautifully decorated temple dedicated to a group of gods headed by Osiris, complete with a famous king list that inscribed the names of earlier rulers whom he wished to honor. This combination of military vigor and pious building projects set the tone for the reign of his son, Usermater Setipener Rameses II, who would later be known simply as Rameses the Great, coming to the throne as a young man and ruling for more than 60 years. Rameses II presided over a period in which Egyptian royal architecture, inscription, and self-presentation reached a particularly grand form. He completed projects begun by his father, expanded the hypostyle hall, and adorned temple walls from Thebes to the Delta with scenes of his exploits. He also established a new royal residence in the eastern Delta, known in Egyptian sources as Pi-Rameses, House of Rameses, which served as both political and logistical base for campaigns into the Levant. The most famous episode of Rameses II's military career was his confrontation with the Hittite kingdom at the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River in what is now western Syria. In the 5th year of his reign, Rameses led an army northward, divided into several divisions named after gods. Hittite forces under King Muwatalli II lay in wait near Kadesh. Egyptian inscriptions from Ramesses temples, especially at Abu Simbel and the Ramesseum, tell of how the king's forces were surprised by Hittite chariots, how Ramesses rallied his men almost single-handedly, and how he turned potential disaster into victory. The narrative is vivid and clearly shaped to glorify the king, showing him fighting surrounded by enemies, supported by the god Amun. When modern historians compare the Egyptian accounts with Hittite records and the likely strategic situation, a more nuanced picture emerges. The battle appears to have ended not in a decisive victory for either side, but in a kind of stalemate. Egyptian forces recovered from the initial surprise and avoided being destroyed, but Kadesh remained under Hittite control. In later years, both powers seem to have recognized that neither could easily dislodge the other from their core territories. Eventually, under Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III, a formal peace treaty was drawn up, recorded in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform. The treaty pledged mutual non-aggression and assistance, and arranged for the return of fugitives. Copies of its text survive in Egypt and in the archives of the Hittite capital, making it one of the earliest known international treaties preserved from the ancient world. After this peace, Ramesses II's foreign policy shifted more toward consolidation and diplomacy. He married at least one Hittite princess, cementing ties between the two courts, and turned considerable attention back to building within Egypt. At Thebes, he added great pylons and courtyards to existing temples. At Luxor, he placed statues and obelisks. On the West Bank, he built his own mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, filled with scenes of his victories and offerings to the gods. In Nubia, At a site now known as Abu Simbel, he commissioned a rock-cut temple whose facade bears 4 colossal seated images of the king, flanked by smaller figures of his family. Inside, engravings and reliefs presented him as conqueror and pious worshipper, bridging the worlds of human and divine. For people sailing along the Nile or approaching Egypt's borders, these monuments would have seemed to proclaim the durability of Ramesses' power, at least if we judge by their sheer scale and the triumphant messages carved into them. Yet even in his long reign, signs of strain were beginning to appear at the edges of the imperial system. Maintaining garrisons abroad, supplying temples with lavish offerings, and sustaining a large royal household all required a steady flow of resources. Inscriptions from the tombs of officials and in administrative papyri hint at disputes over land, tax burdens, and the rights of workers. The very success of the Ramesside display program raised the stakes for what counted as proper royal largesse, making it harder for later, less wealthy kings to match the standards that had been set. After Ramesses II, his son Merneptah inherited a kingdom that was still formidable but increasingly challenged. In his reign, inscriptions record campaigns against Libyan groups to the west and against a coalition of peoples, including some later grouped under the label Sea Peoples, who moved through regions of the eastern Mediterranean. One monument, the so-called Merneptah stele, is especially famous because it mentions a people called Israel among groups in Canaan, the earliest known Egyptian reference to that name. The inscription celebrates Merneptah's victories and emphasizes that he had preserved Egypt from foreign threat. At the same time, the appearance of these new confederations of migrants and raiders is often taken to signal that the geopolitical environment around Egypt was changing. Since they appear alongside the decline or collapse of older Near Eastern states in the written and archaeological record. In the following decades, during the 20th dynasty, these pressures intensified. Under Ramesses III, Egypt faced major incursions by groups described in inscriptions as coming from the sea and from the islands, often associated collectively with the Sea Peoples. Reliefs at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu show battles on land and water. Egyptian forces confronting enemy ships in the Nile mouths, archers shooting from fortified positions, and defeated foes led before the king. The texts celebrate Ramesses III as the one who repelled these invaders and saved Egypt from destruction. Modern scholars continue to debate the exact origins and identities of the groups involved, but the scale of the preparations and the detailed scenes at Medinet Habu suggest that Egyptian elites experienced these confrontations as extremely serious threats to the kingdom's security, based on how comprehensively they chose to record and commemorate them. The successful defense against these incursions did not, however, prevent deeper shifts from taking their toll. Evidence from the later years of Ramesses III and his successors points to economic difficulties and social tension. Records from the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who worked on royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, describe episodes in which workers went unpaid and staged what we might now call strikes, refusing to work until rations were delivered. These texts are exceptional in that they preserve the voices of non-elite Egyptians, complaining about shortages and delays. They reveal that even within the heartland of royal patronage, the flow of goods could falter, and trust in the system could be strained. Beyond Egypt's borders, the wider late Bronze Age world was undergoing profound change. Cities in Anatolia, Syria, and the Aegean were destroyed or abandoned. Long-distance trade networks shrank or shifted. Major states such as the Hittite kingdom collapsed. Egypt remained standing, but its position was altered. Instead of projecting power far into northern Syria, it found itself defending closer frontiers and dealing with new populations settling in regions that had once been under its influence. Internally, the growing importance of certain offices, such as the high priest of Amun at Thebes, and the rising prominence of Libyan military leaders serving within Egypt, pointed toward a redistribution of authority that did not always favor the king. As the 20th dynasty waned, later kings bearing the name Rameses ruled for shorter periods, and their capacity to command resources seems to have diminished. Monuments grew less ambitious, and the quality of some inscriptions and constructions declined. The royal burials in the Valley of the Kings continued for a time, but tomb robberies, both ancient and modern, testify to the vulnerability of royal wealth in an era of tightening circumstances. Administrative documents from this period include investigations into theft, corruption, and misappropriation of temple goods, a combination that has led many historians to picture a state struggling to keep full control over its own officials. By the time the last Ramesside kings faded from the scene, the outline of Egypt's next phase was taking shape. In the Delta, lineages of Libyan origin, whose ancestors had served as military commanders and local chiefs, were establishing themselves as regional powers. In Thebes, the office of the high priest of Amun held vast estates and commanded loyalty in Upper Egypt, sometimes overshadowing the authority of the nominal pharaoh. Egypt was no longer the confident imperial force that had marched to Kadesh or carved colossal statues at Abu Simbel. It was a country. The transformation that followed the Ramesside age did not arrive with a single shock, but with a gradual rearranging of power that left Egypt looking both familiar and subtly altered. The great temples still rose along the Nile. The language and religious forms remained recognizably Egyptian. Yet the balance between king, priests, soldiers, and regional chiefs shifted in ways that would probably have surprised an observer from the days of Ramesses II. Historians call this long phase the Third Intermediate Period, a label that hints at its position between the centralized empires of the New Kingdom and the later resurgence of strong kings. For the people who lived through it, however, it was not an interlude, but their present reality. A world in which authority was shared, contested, and as far as we can tell from surviving records, often divided between multiple centers. The formal end of the New Kingdom is usually placed at the death of Ramesses XI around 1077 BCE. After him, a man named Smens, based in the delta city of Tanis, took on kingly titles and founded what we now call the 21st dynasty. In the south, meanwhile, the high priest of Amun at Thebes exercised royal-level power in Upper Egypt. This dual structure of pharaoh in the north, a priestly house with quasi-kingly authority in the south, is often used to illustrate the character of much of the Third Intermediate Period. It was not a time when Egypt ceased to be a single cultural sphere, but it was a time when different regions could be governed by different hands, each drawing on traditional symbols to assert legitimacy. From Tanis, the kings of the 21st dynasty maintained diplomatic contacts, issued decrees, and oversaw the reburial of royal mummies from earlier times, moving them to hidden caches to protect them from tomb robbers. The high priests of Amun, for their part, controlled significant land and wealth in Upper Egypt, managed temple estates, and performed rituals that had long been associated with kingship. The fact that both sides used royal motifs is usually interpreted to mean that they were not simply local officials, but were presenting themselves as inheritors of the old royal role. Based on inscriptions and temple records, many scholars think that cooperation and negotiated boundaries were common, even if moments of tension surely arose. In the course of the 10th century BCE, new players entered the scene in a more formal way. Families of Libyan origin, whose ancestors had long served as mercenaries and officers in Egyptian service, established their own dynasties. Shawshank I, the founder of the 22nd dynasty, came from such a background and ruled from Bubastes in the eastern delta. He and his successors adopted full pharaonic titulary, married into existing elite families, and presented themselves as restorers of order. In foreign affairs, Shawshank I led a campaign into the Levant, commemorated on the walls of Karnak, and he is often identified with the Shishak, mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as having invaded the kingdom of Judah. Whether or not every detail aligns, the convergence of Egyptian and Levantan sources suggests that Libyan-rooted pharaohs were active participants in the politics of the wider region. Within Egypt, however, the proliferation of dynasties and lines, the 22nd, sometimes overlapping with a 23rd, and even a short-lived 24th, points to a patchwork political landscape. Local rulers in cities such as Leontopolis and Sais claimed royal titles, and governed their immediate territories, while acknowledging or contesting the authority of rival houses. The high priesthood of Amun remained powerful in Thebes, creating a triangle of interests between Delta dynasts, Theban priests, and, increasingly, another force rising from the south, the kingdom of Kush in Nubia, south of Egypt, in the region around Napata near the fourth cataract of the Nile. A robust Nubian state had taken shape. Its rulers, heirs to both local traditions and centuries of contact with Egypt, built temples and adopted aspects of Egyptian religious iconography. By the 8th century BCE, the kings of Kush were strong enough to intervene in Egyptian affairs. One of them, Pe, also called Paenki, led a campaign northward, which he recorded in a long inscription known as the Pe Stela. In it, he describes receiving appeals from certain Delta rulers, sailing north with his forces, and demanding submission from a variety of Egyptian princes and chiefs. Modern readers often describe the tone of this text as that of a reformer and conqueror combined. Pe portrays himself as upholding proper worship of the gods and punishing those who had neglected traditional rites. Over time, Pe and his successors consolidated their control, establishing what modern historians call the 25th dynasty, often referred to as the Kushite or Nubian dynasty. Kings such as Shabako and Taharka ruled both Kush and Egypt, presenting themselves as pharaohs in a consciously archaizing style. Their monuments and temples, including work at sites like Karnak, show a deliberate imitation of Old and Middle Kingdom forms, an artistic choice that is often interpreted as signaling a return to an idealized past. This revivalist tendency has led many scholars to see the Kushite period as a kind of cultural renaissance, in which Egyptian religious and artistic traditions were renewed under Nubian leadership. The Kushite kings, however, did not rule in a vacuum. To the northeast, a new imperial power, Assyria, was expanding from Mesopotamia into the Levant. The 25th dynasty became entangled in the complex politics of the region, supporting some Levantan states that resisted Assyrian dominance. In response, Assyrian rulers such as Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal invaded Egypt in the 7th century BCE. Their campaigns, described in Assyrian annals and echoed in Egyptian sources, brought sieges, battles, and the temporary occupation of key cities, including Memphis. Under this pressure, Kushite control of northern Egypt weakened. Eventually, the Nubian rulers retreated southward, maintaining their kingdom in Kush, but losing their hold on the delta. Out of this turbulent situation emerged a new native Egyptian dynasty based in the delta city of Sais. Psamtik I, founder of the 26th dynasty, initially operated under the shadow of Assyrian influence, but gradually asserted greater independence as Assyrian power declined. His reign, and those of his successors, mark what is often called the Sate Renaissance. These kings looked back consciously to earlier high points in Egyptian history, reviving older artistic conventions and emphasizing continuity with a deep pharaonic past. At the same time, they ruled in a world that appears, from the distribution of finds and written references, to have been more closely connected to the wider Mediterranean than in earlier periods. Greek mercenaries and traders became increasingly common in the Nile Delta during the Sate period. Psamtik I and later kings employed Greek soldiers in their armies and granted Greek communities settlements such as Naucratis, which functioned as a trading hub. This brought Egypt into tighter contact with Greek city-states, not just as a distant land of legend, but as a regular partner in commerce and military affairs. From the Egyptian side, this engagement with foreigners was one more thread in a long history of dealing with peoples of the sea and neighboring lands. From the Greek perspective, as reflected in later writers, Egypt became a source of knowledge, stories, and prestige. Within Egypt, the Sate kings invested in temple building and restoration across the country. They sponsored works at traditional sacred sites, inscribed their names alongside those of earlier pharaohs, and highlighted their role as protectors of Mad in a time of shifting alliances. Rulers such as Necho II also pursued ambitious projects, including canal works that aimed to link the Nile to the Red Sea and naval initiatives that projected Egyptian influence along maritime routes. These undertakings suggest a regime that was both looking backward for legitimacy and outward for opportunity. Yet, the Sate kings could not insulate Egypt from new imperial forces rising further east. The Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II, and soon after, the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Cyrus, and his successors reshaped the political map of the Near East. For a time, Egypt maneuvered between these powers, sometimes allying with one against another. Ultimately, however, the expansion of Persia proved decisive. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt, defeated the Sate ruler Psamtik III, and incorporated the country into the Achaemenid Empire as a satrapy. Cambyses and his successors took on the title of pharaoh in Egyptian contexts, appearing in temple reliefs and offering scenes, but they ruled as distant monarchs within a larger imperial framework. This first period of Persian rule, known as the 27th dynasty, did not erase Egyptian culture or religious practice. Temples continued to function, priests carried out rituals, and local communities maintained their traditions. At the same time, Greek and later Egyptian sources describe grievances over taxation, temple interference, and episodes of harsh treatment. Modern historians weigh these accounts against administrative evidence and archaeological finds. But it is reasonable to say that many Egyptians experienced Persian rule as foreign domination. Even if day-to-day life for most villagers still revolved around the familiar tasks of farming and local cult. In the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE, Egypt saw a series of revolts and brief restorations of native rule. Dynasties numbered 28th, 29th, and 30th in modern schemes represent kings who managed to re-establish independence for some decades. Among them, Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II of the 30th dynasty stand out for their building activity. They sponsored construction and decoration at numerous temples, leaving reliefs and inscriptions from the Delta to Upper Egypt. Based on this building program and the stylistic quality of the art, many scholars view the 30th dynasty as another late flowering of pharaonic culture. Nectanebo II, who came to the throne in the mid-4th century BCE, would become the last native Egyptian pharaoh. For much of his reign, he successfully resisted renewed Persian attempts to retake Egypt, drawing on alliances with Greek city-states and on Egypt's own resources. Eventually, though, the Persian king Artaxerxes III mounted a powerful campaign that overwhelmed Egyptian defenses. Nectanebo II fled south, perhaps to Nubia, and disappears from the historical record. With his fall, Persia reimposed control, inaugurating what scholars call the 31st dynasty, a second period of Achaemenid rule. Once again, Egyptian temples and local institutions persisted under foreign overlordship, but the geopolitical context had shifted yet again. The Persian Empire itself was now facing challenges from the west, where a Macedonian king named Alexander had begun a series of campaigns that would rapidly change the shape of the ancient world. After defeating Persian forces in Asia Minor and the Levant, Alexander turned toward Egypt. In 332 BCE, he advanced into the Nile Valley, where, according to later accounts, many Egyptians viewed him as a liberator from Persian rule. He visited Memphis, made offerings to Egyptian gods, and traveled to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa, a journey that later writers would present as a moment of divine confirmation of his kingship. During his stay, Alexander laid out plans for a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. Generally, with the arrival of Alexander and the decision of his general Ptolemy to claim Egypt as his share of the divided empire, the land of the Nile entered a new phase. In form, it still looked like a kingdom of pharaohs. Kings were crowned with traditional regalia, temples to ancient gods received offerings, and scribes wrote in hieroglyphs on the walls of sanctuaries. In substance, however, the ruling house was now Macedonian Greek, part of the wider Hellenistic world that stretched from the Mediterranean to the edges of India. Ptolemy, who had served as one of Alexander's close companions, at first acted as satrap, or governor, on behalf of a notional Macedonian kingship. By 305 BCE, he openly took the title of king, and soon after he and his successors were recognized in Egyptian texts as pharaohs. The dynasty he founded, which modern historians call the Ptolemaic, would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Under Ptolemy Isoter, as he came to be known, Alexandria became the effective capital of this kingdom, founded by Alexander on a strip of land between the Mediterranean and the western arm of the Nile Delta. The city grew into a major port and administrative center. Its streets were laid out in a grid, lined with colonnades, public buildings, and royal palaces fronting the sea. While Memphis and other older cities retained religious and symbolic importance, Ptolemaic kings were still crowned at Memphis, the pulse of government, and much of the kingdom's international commerce now beat in Alexandria. Greek was the language of administration and high culture at court, while Egyptian, in its various written forms, continued to serve temple, local, and everyday purposes. The Ptolemies presented themselves in a dual fashion. In Greek contexts, they appeared as Hellenistic monarchs, heirs of Alexander, wielding power in a style familiar to other Greek-speaking elites. In Egyptian settings, they adopted traditional royal titles, wore the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt in reliefs, and made offerings to deities such as Amun, Ptah, and Isis. Over time, new religious syntheses emerged. One of the most distinctive was the cult of Serapis, a god who combined aspects of Egyptian and Greek divinity. Ptolemaic kings promoted Serapis, especially in Alexandria, where his temple, the Serapeum, became a major landmark. The prominence of such cults has led many historians to think that both rulers and at least some subjects were willing to experiment with forms of worship that spoke to more than one cultural heritage at once. Another hallmark of early Ptolemaic rule was their investment in scholarship and learning. In Alexandria, the royal family supported an institution known as the Mauseon, or Place of the Muses, which housed scholars, poets, and scientists from across the Greek-speaking world. Attached to it, or closely associated with it, was the famous Library of Alexandria. Ancient accounts describe its collections in grand terms, speaking of hundreds of thousands of scrolls gathered from many regions. Modern historians debate the precise size and organization of this library, and the dramatic stories later told about its destruction blend history with legend. Still, on the basis of surviving references, it is reasonable to see the Mauseon and library as a key center, where Greek, Egyptian, and other Near Eastern traditions of knowledge were collected, compared, and reworked. Economically, Ptolemaic Egypt was one of the wealthiest states of the Hellenistic age. The Nile's predictable floods, managed through irrigation and careful administration, yielded abundant grain. The state took an active role in organizing agriculture, taxation, and monopolies on certain goods, from papyrus to oil. Revenues from this system funded the court, the army, and ambitious building projects. In addition to traditional temples along the river, the Ptolemies erected new structures that blended Greek and Egyptian styles. They also maintained or expanded harbors to facilitate trade with the Aegean, the Levant, and beyond. From the perspective of many Mediterranean merchants, judging from written contracts and accounts, Egypt under the Ptolemies appears to have been both a reliable source of grain and a market for wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods. Alexandria itself became a strikingly cosmopolitan city. Its population included Greeks from various regions, Egyptians from different parts of the Nile Valley, and communities of Jews and other Near Eastern peoples. The city's quarters reflected these diverse origins, and inscriptions show that different groups maintained their own institutions, temples, and associations, while also engaging with one another in markets and public spaces. Greek was the language of most public inscriptions, but Egyptian religious festivals and imagery remained part of the landscape. Later writers would recall Alexandria as a place of intense intellectual life and cultural mixing, where philosophical debates, religious processions, and commercial activity all unfolded side by side. Within Egypt as a whole, Ptolemaic rule brought both continuity and strain. Temples continued to function, often with generous royal patronage, but they also formed centers of local identity that could become focal points of resistance. Taxation was carefully recorded in Greek and Demotic documents, and in some periods, the demands on villagers and landowners appear to have been heavy. Scholars studying papyri from the countryside have identified episodes of unrest and even extended revolts, particularly in Upper Egypt, where local leaders sometimes rallied support against royal officials. As far as we can tell from surviving evidence, these movements were rarely strong enough to topple the dynasty, but they reveal that pharaonic imagery and Hellenistic administration did not always sit comfortably together. Inside the royal house, politics followed a pattern common in Hellenistic monarchies, but intensified in Egypt by local traditions. Ptolemaic kings and queens often married within their own family, with brother-sister unions becoming standard among later rulers. These marriages, presented in Egyptian iconography as idealized royal couples, also helped concentrate legitimacy in a narrow circle. At the same time, they contributed to bitter rivalries over succession, court intrigues, shifting alliances, and occasional murders punctuated the line of Ptolemaic rulers. From the outside, the dynasty could appear stable and enduring. From within, it was often marked, if we judge by the narratives of ancient historians, by persistent tension. Out of this complex background emerged Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers. Born into the royal family in the 1st century BCE, she became co-ruler with her father Ptolemy XII, and later with her brothers, according to the usual pattern of joint rule. Ancient authors, especially Plutarch, portray her as highly educated. Some sources say she spoke multiple languages, including Egyptian as well as Greek. In an era when many of her predecessors may have relied chiefly on Greek, while modern historians are cautious about taking every detail in these accounts at face value. The overall picture they convey is of a queen who was unusually engaged with both the Greek and Egyptian dimensions of her kingdom. Cleopatra's reign unfolded at a time when Rome had become the dominant power around the Mediterranean. Internal Roman conflicts, however, created openings for ambitious foreign rulers. Cleopatra's alliance with Julius Caesar began when he intervened in a dynastic struggle between her and her brother Ptolemy XIII. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra secured her position in Egypt. She later bore him a son, Ptolemy XV, commonly called Caesarion. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra aligned herself with Mark Antony, one of the key Roman leaders vying for control. Their political and personal partnership linked Egypt's fate closely to the outcome of Roman civil wars, at least as those events were perceived by observers in both Alexandria and Rome. Antony and Cleopatra's opponents, especially Octavian, who would become the Emperor Augustus, presented this alliance as a dangerous fusion of foreign monarchy and Roman power. In a famous episode known as the Donations of Alexandria, Antony appeared with Cleopatra and their children in an Alexandrian ceremony that conferred titles and territories in the eastern Mediterranean upon them. From Octavian's point of view, or at least in the propaganda attributed to his circle, this could be painted as a betrayal of Roman interests in favor of an Eastern court. The Roman Senate eventually declared war not on Antony by name, but on Cleopatra as Queen of Egypt, a formulation that underscored how central her kingdom had become to the conflict. The decisive clash came at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, off the western coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded in part by his general Agrippa, confronted the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Ancient sources describe a complex engagement of ships and maneuvers. In the end, Cleopatra's squadron broke away and withdrew, and Antony followed. Their departure demoralized the remaining forces, and Octavian emerged with the upper hand. The following year, Octavian's armies advanced into Egypt. Facing defeat, Antony took his own life, and soon afterward Cleopatra also died, traditionally said to have committed suicide in her mausoleum. Whatever the exact circumstances, their deaths brought an end to the independent Ptolemaic monarchy. With Cleopatra's fall in 30 BCE, Egypt became a province of the Roman state. Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, treated Egypt differently from some other conquered territories. He ruled it as his personal domain, appointing a prefect of equestrian rank, rather than sending a senator as governor. This arrangement kept Egypt and its resources firmly under the emperor's control, and limited the opportunities for rival Roman elites to gain a power base there. From Rome's perspective, The key asset was Egypt's grain. Shipments from the Nile Valley helped feed the population of Rome and later other major cities, making the fertile floodplain a crucial part of the imperial system. Life within Egypt under Roman rule combined new administrative structures with persistent local traditions. Roman law and taxation practices overlaid older frameworks, and Latin began to appear alongside Greek and Egyptian in official contexts. Although Greek remained the main language of administration for centuries, temples to Egyptian gods continued to receive offerings, priesthoods remained active, and many villages went about their agricultural routines much as before. At the same time, new forms of religious expression, such as the imperial cult, which honored the emperor in ways that partially echoed older ruler worship, found a place in the landscape, often in or near existing sacred sites. Alexandria retained its status as a major city, often described in modern scholarship as second only to Rome in much of the empire. It was a center of trade and manufacturing, producing papyrus, glass, textiles, and other goods. Philosophical schools, Jewish and later Christian communities, and learned circles all had a presence there. The city's ethnic and cultural mix continued, sometimes leading to tensions, as different groups navigated questions of privilege, taxation, and civic identity under Roman oversight. For Egyptians living outside the metropolis, these imperial currents might have felt distant, but they could still see their effects in the presence of Roman soldiers, new judicial procedures, and shifting patterns of land ownership. From a long view, the transition from Ptolemaic to Roman rule can be seen as both an ending and a transformation. On one level, the line of pharaohs in the traditional sense came to a close with Cleopatra. From the vantage point of Rome, the conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE could be seen as a clean break. A great Hellenistic kingdom absorbed into a new imperial order. From within Egypt, however, the change was likely experienced more gradually, at least as far as we can infer from surviving texts and material remains. Temples still rang with hymns to ancient gods, priests still interpreted dreams and omens, and the Nile still rose and fell in its age-old rhythm. Yet over the centuries that followed, new currents began to flow through the country, political, religious, and cultural, altering how Egyptians understood their world and their place in it. If we follow these currents carefully, we can watch the long-lived civilization of the pharaohs changing shape rather than simply disappearing. In the first centuries of Roman rule, Egypt functioned as a crucial province of the empire, prized above all for its grain. The emperor and his administrators took pains to ensure that the harvest was collected, taxed, and shipped efficiently, especially to Rome and other major cities. Greek remained the primary language of administration, with Latin used in higher-level military and legal contexts. In the countryside, Egyptian in its Demotic script continued in contracts, temple records, and local correspondence. Socially, there was no single, uniform Romanizing wave. Instead, as far as the evidence suggests, Roman soldiers, officials, and merchants joined a landscape that already included Greek settlers, long-established Jewish communities, and Egyptians of many regional backgrounds. Religiously, the early Roman centuries were marked more by variety than by uniformity, so far as we can reconstruct. Traditional cults of deities such as Amun, Isis, Osiris, Sobek, and Hathor continued, especially at long-standing temples along the Nile. Some gods took on wider significance beyond Egypt's borders. The cult of Isis, for example, spread around the Mediterranean, with temples dedicated to her found in places as far afield as Rome, Pompeii, and the Black Sea coast. In these settings, she was often presented in forms that blended Egyptian and Greco-Roman imagery, a pattern that suggests devotion to Egyptian deities could adapt to new environments while preserving a sense of their origin. Within Egypt itself, Alexandria remained a unique urban center. Its population was a mosaic of Greek-speaking elites, Egyptian residents, and sizable Jewish communities, among others. Philosophical schools debated there, scientists and physicians pursued studies, traders passed through its harbors on their way between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. In this city, new religious and intellectual movements found fertile ground. One of the most far-reaching of these was Christianity, which arrived in Egypt within a few generations of its emergence in the eastern Mediterranean. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, Christian communities were established in Alexandria and in other towns, meeting in houses and adapting biblical texts into Greek and, increasingly, into Egyptian forms. At first, Christianity existed alongside older cults, sometimes viewed with suspicion by authorities, sometimes tolerated, sometimes persecuted, depending on imperial policy and local circumstances. Over time, however, the balance shifted. When the Emperor Constantine extended favor to Christianity in the 4th century, and later emperors went further in supporting it, Christian institutions gained new visibility and resources. Bishops of Alexandria became influential figures, not only in religious affairs, but in wider political and social life. Theological debates that took shape in the city about the nature of Christ, about the relationship between human and divine, reverberated across the Roman world. As Christian influence grew, traditional temples faced increasing pressure. Some shrank in importance as patronage shifted, others were closed or repurposed. Imperial edicts in the late 4th century limited or banned public pagan rites in many areas. In Egypt, the impact varied from place to place. Certain temple complexes continued activity longer than might be expected, sustained by local devotion and their distance from major urban centers. Sites such as Philae, on an island near the southern border, retained active cults into the 5th and even early 6th centuries, serving in the eyes of later observers as a kind of last stronghold of traditional worship. Eventually, though, even these sanctuaries ceased to function in their original way. Shrines became quarries for building stone, quiet ruins along the river, or, in some cases, locations for new churches. These religious changes coincided with shifts in language and writing. Hieroglyphic inscriptions on temple walls and stelae, always the preserve of specialized scribes, became rarer. Demotic, the cursive script used for many everyday documents, remained in use for several centuries under Roman rule. But gradually, another written form of Egyptian rose to prominence. Coptic. Coptic used the Greek alphabet, supplemented by a few signs borrowed from Demotic, to represent sounds not found in Greek. It first appeared in transcriptions of names and phrases, and was soon employed more widely as Christian texts were translated into Egyptian. Coptic became the main medium for Egyptian-speaking Christians to read scripture and sermons in their own tongue. In this way, the ancient language of the Nile Valley survived, reshaped through a new script and infused with new religious vocabulary. Administratively, Egypt's position also evolved. In the later 3rd century, the Roman Empire adopted new structures to cope with internal and external pressures. Provinces were reorganized, and Egypt became part of a broader diocese, still important, but woven into a more layered system of governance. When the empire split more clearly into western and eastern halves in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, Egypt fell under the authority of the eastern, Greek-speaking sphere that we often refer to as the Byzantine Empire. From the Nile's banks, these shifts in imperial capitals, from Rome to Constantinople, may have seemed distant, but they had effects on tax policies, military recruitment, and the flow of officials through the country. In the Byzantine period, Christianity was firmly established as the dominant religion, but divisions within the church became sharper. Debates over doctrine, such as the controversies following the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE, led to tensions between bishops who accepted the council's definitions and those, especially in Egypt, who did not. Many Egyptian Christians came to identify with what would later be called the Coptic Orthodox Church, emphasizing a particular understanding of Christ's nature, and developing their own monastic and theological traditions. Monasteries flourished in the deserts to the east and west of the Nile, places where men and women withdrew from urban life to seek spiritual discipline. These communities, with their own rhythms of work, prayer, and writing, became important centers of learning and identity. For villagers along the Nile, daily routines still revolved around agriculture and local markets. They now moved within an officially Christian empire, attended church rather than temple for major rites, and heard scripture and homilies in Coptic or Greek, tax demands could be heavy, and records from papyri attest to petitions, complaints, and negotiations between local communities and representatives of the imperial administration. The sense of belonging to an ancient land with its own saints and martyrs grew alongside the memory of older divine beings whose images still watched from worn temple walls. In the 7th century, a new power appeared on Egypt's horizon. The early Islamic state, founded in Arabia, expanded rapidly into the Near East and North Africa. Muslim armies entered Egypt in the 630s and early 640s, encountering Byzantine forces and local populations, who, according to some contemporary and later sources, were weary of heavy taxes and religious disputes. After a series of campaigns and sieges, the Arab commander Amr ibn al-As secured control over much of the country. A new administrative center, Fustat, was established near the old stronghold of Babylon, south of modern Cairo. From this point forward, Egypt would be integrated into a succession of Islamic empires and dynasties, from the early caliphates to the Fatimids, Ayyubids, Mamluks, and beyond. The Islamic conquest did not erase Egypt's past any more than earlier changes had. Arabic gradually became the language of administration, and over time, of everyday speech. But Coptic continued in church contexts, and in some communities for many centuries. Churches, monasteries, and Christian communities adapted to new frameworks, negotiating their status under Muslim rule. Ancient temples and tombs, long abandoned as active cult sites, remained as striking features in the landscape. Some were incorporated into local folklore. Others were mined for stone. Still others became attractions for travelers curious about the great works of earlier ages, the outlines of gigantic pylons, and the silent faces of colossal statues looked down on new fields, new towns, and new prayers. For a long stretch of the medieval period, knowledge of how to read the old hieroglyphic inscriptions was lost. Egyptian and foreign observers could admire the artistry of the reliefs and the scale of the architecture, but the texts themselves were opaque. Greek and Roman writers had left descriptions of Egypt, and some of their works circulated in Arabic translations, but the direct link to the words carved on the temple walls had been broken. This gap in understanding contributed to the air of mystery that surrounded the monuments. They seemed to belong to an unimaginably ancient time, accessible only through stories and guesses. In the early modern period, European travelers began to visit Egypt in greater numbers, drawn by biblical associations, classical references, and the fame of its ruins. Artists sketched temples, obelisks, and desert landscapes. Collectors acquired antiquities, sometimes with little regard for their original context. The most dramatic turning point in European engagement came at the end of the 18th century, when Napoleon Bonaparte led an expedition to Egypt alongside soldiers. He brought engineers, artists, and scholars who documented monuments, inscriptions, flora, fauna, and contemporary life. The multi-volume description de l'Egypte that emerged from their work helped introduce a wide audience to the wealth of the country's ancient remains. Among the objects recorded during these campaigns was a stone slab discovered near the town of Rosetta in the Delta. This stela bore a decree written in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. Scholars quickly realized that the Greek text, which could be read, corresponded to the others. Over the following decades, linguists and antiquarians struggled to unlock the system behind the hieroglyphs. The breakthrough is usually associated with Jean-François Champollion, who, building on the efforts of others, announced in the 1820s that he had deciphered the hieroglyphic script by comparing the Greek and Egyptian texts and recognizing that some hieroglyphs represented sounds rather than just ideas. He and his contemporaries opened the way to reading the vast corpus of inscriptions left by ancient Egyptians themselves. With this decipherment, ancient Egypt's own voice became audible again in a new way. Inscriptions on temple walls, tomb autobiographies, royal decrees, and humble ostraca could now be studied not just as decorations, but as texts. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, the discipline of Egyptology took shape, with excavations, publications, and museum collections expanding rapidly. These efforts brought to light an enormous range of material: village archives, wisdom literature, love poems, legal contracts, hymns, and administrative records. They also raised questions about ownership, preservation, and the impact of excavation on the people living near the sites. Museums in Europe and North America, filled with artifacts removed from the Nile Valley, even as Egyptian scholars and institutions sought to preserve and interpret their own heritage. In modern Egypt, ancient monuments continue to play multiple roles. They are sites of tourism, economic resources, symbols of national identity, and objects of scholarly study. Temples at Luxor, Karnak, Edfu, and Philae, pyramids at Giza and Dashur, rock-cut tombs in the valleys of the kings and queens, all draw visitors from around the world. Conservation projects work to stabilize walls, protect painted surfaces, and manage the impact of millions of feet and cameras. Meanwhile, the descendants of those who built, occupied, and repurposed these sites over millennia live nearby, farming the same riverbanks, walking past the same silhouettes of stone at sunrise and sunset. From a broad historical perspective, the story of ancient Egypt becomes less a tale of rise and fall than one of transformation and endurance. Dynasties come and go, capitals shift, gods are worshipped, reinterpreted, or replaced. Scripts change from hieroglyphs and